The Avengers vs. the Peter Factor, My Personal Redo by midnightwolf2192. Chapter 5, Natasha. None of the Avengers were due to meet Peter Parker, not if Tony and Pepper had their way. Just because they lived in the tower didn't mean that Tony had to invite them back into his life. He was cordial with them whenever there were meetings, or if he met them in the gym, but beyond that, it was highly unlikely they would ever return to the family-like atmosphere that used to surround the tower. Peter spent most of his time at the tower in the labs, Pepper's office, or on Tony's private floor. The only Avenger with access to that floor was Bruce, but as yet the other man hadn't used those privileges. He had been in Norway, helping the Asgardians settle into their new surroundings, and hadn't yet returned to New York. Natasha was only one of the returning Avengers whom Tony was on speaking terms with. The night she had cornered him was one that stuck out in both of their minds. She had apologized profusely for what happened in Berlin, and what happened after. She was just as mad as Tony that Steve had kept the secret about Howard and Maria's death from him. Tony had eventually forgiven her for everything, and they were slowly getting their friendship back on track. But that didn't mean that Nat wanted to push it. She knew that she had betrayed him, and while Tony had forgiven her, that didn't mean his protection squad had. So none of the team went near Tony's and Pepper's private floor, thus meaning that the secret of Peter Parker was safe for now. Nat was technically the first non-Iron Family Avenger to meet Peter, and the introduction had been just as sweet and as natural as one could have hoped for. Nat awoke with an aborted scream. She could never remember her nightmares, and while this one was no different, the outcome was always the same. The blankets on her body became stifling, so she violently kicked them off. Knowing that sleep would evade her now, Nat climbed out of bed and slid her feet into her slippers. She walked out of her room and slowly made her way down to the communal kitchen. She noticed that the light was on, but she just assumed it was one of the other Avengers. She was stunned, however, to find a teenaged boy hunched over the kitchen bench. Nat approached the boy silently and heard him mumbling to himself. It sounded like he was alternating between English and Spanish. Nat was shocked when the boy looked up and made eye contact with her. She had been absolutely certain she hadn't made a sound. Rather than being startled, the boy simply looked Nat up and down before returning to the book in front of him. The Russian spy looked at the boy in confusion. He couldn't be more than 14 or 15 years old. So what the hell was he doing in the Avengers communal kitchen? He certainly didn't belong to Clint, because her best friend would have told her A, about his kids visiting, and B, about a kid that he and Laura had adopted. None of the other Avengers were parents, so that ruled any of them out. The kid obviously wasn't a hostile because Friday hadn't sounded any alarms. Keeping her senses attuned to the stranger, she set about boiling some water to fix herself up a cup of tea. The Black Widow turned sharply as she heard a loud thump, and noticed that the boy had dropped his head heavily onto the book he had been reading. Not knowing what to do, Natasha turned back to the kettle as it finished boiling, and poured the hot water over the loose-leaf tea in the teapot she had found. She only turned around again when she heard soft sniffles emerging from the boy. He was crying, but trying hard to hide it. Natasha felt something inside her break when the boy cried. Maternal feelings rose to the surface, and Nat was loath to shake them away. She poured 2 cups of tea and sat down close to the boy. The boy looked up at Nat with large, watery eyes, and Nat vowed then and there that she would never let anything harm this kid, no matter who he was. "All right," Nat said softly, as she handed the boy his cup of tea. "Let's destroy whatever it is that is making you cry." He let out a soft laugh and allowed Nat to pull his Spanish work towards her. The spy read over the work and gave the teen a few hints or corrections. The boy was damn smart, so he hadn't needed much help. "I'm Peter," the boy said quietly as he finally closed his Spanish book. "Thank you for the help, Miss Romanoff." "Call me Nat, little one," Natasha replied, saying little one in Russian, as she ruffled some of Peter's curls out of his face. The boy crinkled his nose at the term, even though he had no idea what it meant. I should move on to my chemistry work, Peter said softly, as he cast a look back to the pile of books on the counter. No, you should sleep, Nat replied firmly, adopting a tone she had learnt from Laura. The work will still be there tomorrow. It's Saturday, so you have plenty of time to finish it. The boy attempted to protest, but Nat just gave him a look that she knew could frighten even the toughest of men. Peter sighed, but eventually nodded, and Nat smiled triumphantly. She put their empty cups into the sink and walked back over to where Peter was now standing by the bench. Peter took her outstretched hand, and Nat began to lead him towards the bedrooms. She placed herself in front of Peter protectively when the elevator doors opened, but she relaxed slightly when a slightly panicked, yet still sleepy, Tony Stark stumbled out. Fry, baby, tell Pepper I found the kid, Tony said to the ceiling before walking over to the pair. Pete, I could have sworn I put you to bed hours ago. Why am I now finding you down here holding hands with a super spy? As Peter began to ramble, Nat could only smile. While doing his homework, Peter had spoken very little, but now he couldn't seem to stop himself. Peter's voice washed over her, and Nat smiled as she closed her eyes. His voice was familiar, but she couldn't quite work out where she had heard it before. After a minute, her eyes snapped open sharply, and she locked her gaze onto Stark and Peter. You're Spider-Man, Nat said with finality. Peter stopped rambling and looked up at Tony. The billionaire shrugged, and Peter nodded at Nat. It's still bedtime. Superheroes need sleep too. Peter laughed and surprised both Tony and Natasha by walking over to the Black Widow and wrapping his arms around her. Nat rested one hand on Peter's back and the other curled into his hair. Good night, baby spider, Nat said softly as she pressed a kiss to Peter's head. Sweet dreams. Peter kept the hug going for a few more seconds before pulling away and walking over towards the elevator. Tony ruffled his hair as Peter passed, and the teen half-heartedly swatted at his mentor's hand. Once the elevator doors closed, Nat returned to her room. She crawled back under the covers once more, and this time her dreams were filled with baby spiders. The next morning, Nat woke up before everyone else, and when she entered the kitchen, she realized that all of Peter's schoolwork was still sitting on the table. She knew she didn't have long before Steve woke up for his run, so she quickly packed all of the work into Peter's school bag. She had just hidden the bag under the sink when Steve entered the kitchen. Morning, Nat, Steve said, and Nat nodded at the soldier. Sleep well? I did, actually. First time for everything, Nat replied, and Steve nodded. Nat set about making herself a cup of coffee when she realized Steve still hadn't left yet. She turned to him as the machine started and raised an eyebrow. What's wrong with you? Steve started, but he stopped. Nat continued staring at him, and Steve sighed. Have you spoken with Tony? Not for a few days. Why? Nat asked, and Steve sighed again. Steve, you know why he won't see you. I know, but I want to apologize, Steve said almost pathetically, and Nat rolled her eyes. Steve, this goes beyond a simple apology, Nat said firmly, and when Steve attempted to interrupt, she held up her hand to silence him. Steve, you betrayed Tony's trust. And you know how hard it is for Tony to give his trust to anyone. You broke something in him. It's going to take more than an apology to repair that relationship. And you need to be prepared. For what? Steve asked, and Nat sighed. For the fact that your relationship with Tony may be beyond repair, Nat said, and she felt no pleasure in watching Steve's face fall. Be respectful of the fact that he's letting you live here again. Respect that he doesn't want to see you. Don't try and work your way around Friday or anything. Don't corner him at the end of meetings. This isn't something that can be fixed overnight. I know, Steve said dejectedly. I'm going for my run. The super soldier left the kitchen and Nat sighed. She knew where Steve was coming from, but that wouldn't help. Nat poured herself a cup of coffee and then remembered the bag under the sink. She pulled it out, slung it over her shoulder, and walked over to the elevator. Friday, could you please ask Tony if I can come up? I need to return Peter's bag. Or does he want me to just send the bag up in the elevator? Nat asked as the doors opened. Boss says you are fine to come up, spy lady, Friday said, and Nat rolled her eyes at the nickname. The elevator doors closed once Nat was inside, and the elevator travelled up a few floors to the penthouse. When she arrived, Nat could smell the bacon, eggs and pancakes cooking. She put Peter's backpack on the lounge and followed her nose to the kitchen. Tony was sitting at the table flicking through a newspaper, while Pepper and Peter worked at the stove. Nat walked further into the room, and Tony looked up from the paper with a grin.
Morning, Nat,
Tony said, and Peter turned from the stove. He waved at Nat before returning to his cooking. Morning. Thanks for letting me up. I just wanted to drop the baby spider's school bag up before anyone else noticed. I'll go now, Nat said, but before she could move, Peter had bolted to her side. Please stay for breakfast, Mrs. Black Widow Natasha, ma'am, Peter said, and Nat raised an eyebrow at the name. Miss Pepper and I made tons of food.
Friday, make Nat's name in my phone, Miss Black Widow Natasha, ma'am, please, baby girl,
Tony teased, and Nat flipped him off. She then turned back to Peter with a smile. Of course, baby spider. I'd love to stay for breakfast, Nat replied, and she allowed Peter to pull her into one of the chairs. Soon he and Pepper had served up the food, with the small group dug in with gusto. Nat watched Tony and Peter interact as they ate, and she could only smile at how carefree her friend was. Nat continued to eat Saturday morning breakfast with Tony, Pepper and Peter for a few weeks, and in that time, she found herself becoming more and more attached to the baby spider. 3 weeks after their initial meeting, the Avengers were all called into a meeting with Fury. He had a mission for them, but not all of them would be required to go. Unfortunately, Tony was one of those required to go.
I can't go, Nat,
Tony said as they left the conference room. When Nat raised an eyebrow, he sighed.
Peter's aunt has gone away for the weekend for a work conference, and he's staying with me. But Pepper is in Hong Kong, meeting with the SI board there. I can't leave the kid alone for the weekend. I promised him we'd work on his suit this weekend.
Tony, you're needed for the mission, Nat said softly. I can stay with Peter. I'm not needed for once, so I'd be happy to watch the baby spider. Tony nodded at the spy and surprised both of them by pulling the woman into a hug. They broke apart, and Tony headed up to the penthouse to get his things ready, while Natasha went down to the gym. 1 hour later, the team, minus Bucky, Nat and Clint, were getting ready to board the Quinjet. Sam, Rhodey and Steve were already on board, but Tony was still standing with Nat.
Happy will drop him off at about 3:30. I called Pete at lunchtime to explain everything, and he's really excited. He's not allergic to anything that we know of, but Helen will be in the tower all weekend if you need anything,
Tony said, and Nat watched him with a fond smile.
He has a curfew of 2 a.m. on Fridays and Saturdays for a Spider-Man gig, so if he isn't back by then, make sure to punish him.
Tony! Nat called when it seemed like the man was building up speed. You'll be back by lunchtime on Sunday. Dinner time at the latest. The baby spider and I will be fine. We are in your tower, and both Friday and Happy are on hand. Stop stressing and focus on the mission. Tony nodded, and after giving Nat one final hug, he walked over to the jet and climbed on board. The jet took off, and Nat returned to the Avengers floor once they were gone. That afternoon, Nat was waiting for Peter on Tony's floor. She wasn't nervous, thank you very much. She heard the elevator arrive, and couldn't help the smile that crossed her face as Peter bounded out of the elevator. Hi, Miss Nat! Peter had finally done away with the long name, but she just couldn't shake him out of the use of Ms. But if that's what it took for Peter to call her Nat, then so be it. Hey, baby spider, how was school? Nat asked as Peter kicked off his shoes and joined her on the lounge. Peter launched into a detailed description of his day, and Nat listened to it on intently. While this was happening, Friday, unbeknownst to anyone, placed another check mark on the boss's board. When Nat tucked Peter into bed that night, he had been out patrolling, but Nat had waited up for him. She smoothed the curls back from his face. As the boy drifted off to sleep, Nat swore to any and all listening gods that she would protect this boy with her life. If anyone messed with him, they would see why she was one of the most feared assassins the Red Room had ever produced. The Peter Factor 5, Avengers 0. End of chapter. Hi guys, hope you enjoyed that one. I love that chapter. I really do. Nat just almost immediately mother mode, and she just helps Peter with his work. And I love how it shows how smart she is silently. She doesn't ask Peter any questions, but she figures out that he's not Clint's kid, and he's not one of the other Avengers' kids that she knows of, and he's not hostile because Friday's not kicking up a fuss. And the fact that she waits up for him with his patrol is just so sweet. Anyway, you guys know the drill. Like, comment and subscribe and hit that bell to get notified for whenever I upload a new video. Have a good day, night, or whatever time zone you're in. Bye my guys, gals and non-binary pals. I'll see you in another video. Take care.